Thanks everybody, and aren't I lucky to be between you and your coffee. I'm going to talk about the functional recovery today. Obviously that's the theme why we're here, but not about fidelity very much, except as it's got to do with functional recovery. But I basically wanted to look a little bit today at where functional recovery fits into things, where we've come from, where we're at, and to finish up with a few thoughts about where we still need to go. So obviously a good place to start is with some history. And I was thinking about this when I was putting this together, going, well, exactly what history do I want to talk about? And I thought I'd start by looking at, and I think Pat alluded to this a little bit, and probably so did Joe, at what the purposes of treatment have been historically in mental health. And when I'm talking about historically, I was reading something while I was getting ready for this, talking about, going back into the sort of 15th and 16th century, so quite historically, really. And if you read about, the development of asylums through that time, what you tend to come to the conclusion of is that that kind of treatment was really just about containment. And often if you read some of the stuff there, it was actually also often about removing the people from society, whether it was poor people, sick people, whoever it might have been, into these institutions, some of whom had mental illness, some of whom didn't, but basically getting them out of sight and out of mind. And even though there was a development of a more humane approach to that, by and large, up until probably in some senses the end of the asylum era, that was the purpose of that kind of treatment. And then medication, I thought, well, the purpose of that is the reduction of symptoms, and that's a fine purpose, but not in isolation. When I look at, my part of this in terms of therapies and psychologists, a lot of that was, again, about reduction of distress, developing insight into symptoms, maybe some family sort of work, and family functioning. And then case management in its more brokerage sort of sense wasn't really about doing much more than trying to connect people to ways to fill in the time taking care of their welfare and doing a whole range of other things. And really what was missing in all of that was this concept of recovery, to the degree that you can actually find quotes like this from Alan Belloc, which is not that long ago, basically saying there was no assumption of recovery, saying that the concept of recovery in schizophrenia would have seemed like an oxymoron to a people a generation ago. And by that, I presume he's talking any time before the mid-1980s probably. And probably one of the reasons why things started to change in that period of time was out of the deinstitutionalisation and the greater presence of consumer and carer voices. We started to have a conversation about recovery that went beyond the reduction of symptoms and the containment of people. Basically saying that recovery from mental illness involves much more than recovery from the illness itself. People with mental illness may have to recover from the stigma they've incorporated into their very being, from the iatrogenic effects of treatment settings, from lack of recent opportunities for self-determination, from the negative side effects of unemployment, and from crushed dreams. Recovery is often a complex, time-consuming process. And he went on to say, professionals do not hold the key to recovery. The task of professionals is to facilitate recovery. The task of consumers is to recover. And Patricia Deegan, who's a writer whose work I love a lot, there's many, many great things that she said. But the goal of recovery is not to get mainstreamed. We don't want to be mainstreamed. We say let the mainstream become a wide stream that has room for all of us and leaves no one stranded on the fringes. Recovery is not a super well-defined concept, and I'm not going to get into all of the debates about exactly what recovery means, save to say that it needs to be broader than some of the things that I was taught when I was doing my training. But to put it in context, functional recovery is only a small part of the overall recovery journey that people have to go on. And the part that I'm going to talk particularly about today, which is vocational recovery, is a smaller part of that again. So sometimes I feel anyway that I talk about particularly vocational recovery like it's the be-all and end-all of stuff, but I need people to keep in mind that it's actually a small part of the big job that people are undertaking. I wanted to, I don't know if anyone knows that book by Harakumi Murakami or whatever his name is, that says what I talk about when I talk about running. I wanted to Photoshop that front cover of that to say what I talk about when I am talking about functional recovery, but I couldn't do it. My technical skills aren't there. So basically this is the dumbed down version of that. What is functional recovery and why do we need it? There's a definition which is getting a bit more sciencey that I do like though. It's fulfilment of age-appropriate role expectations. So in particular, education and employment. That's the first step. And this tells you a little about why we need to address functional recovery. It talks about the proportion of people who don't finish school, which is estimated to be around about 40% of young people with mental illness, not psychosis specifically. The proportion of people, which is about 30%, who don't join any kind of other social groups. The number of people, which is around about 60%, who are disinclined to apply for work because they anticipate they'll be discriminated against. And obviously you end up then with around about 25% of people who disengage from all of those things completely. So we need functional recovery around these activities. Engagement in social interactions. And so why do we need that? Well, this is data from the SHIP study from a few years ago. And if you look down that list of things there, you can see that people with psychosis, who are living with psychosis, have got greatly diminished social contact compared to the rest of the population. There's something like a fifth of people feel socially isolated. Nearly half of people would actually like to have more contact with people. And significant numbers, 2/3 of people who didn't participate in any kind of social programs in the last year. So we need it because people are lonely and isolated. So back to the definition then, performance of daily living tasks without supervision. And focusing a bit on physical health, and I know Phil's going to talk about this later, but there's been this increasing concentration or increasing focus on this in the last sort of 5 or 10 years now, because we understand that people's physical health suffers in all of this, that people have shorter lifespans out of it, and significantly shorter, and that it's been getting worse over time. And in terms of where people want to live, I'm never going to be a Jedi with this later. Basically, the graph up there sort of says that irrespective of where people are living, most people aren't living in their preferred living situation. And it ranges from about a fifth to well over half of people in every situation wishing that they were living in another different and likely more independent living situation. Which brings us then to the question of when should we address functional recovery? I like to think that I'm not that old, but increasingly I'm forced to confront the fact that I did my training in the last millennium. And what I was taught then was that we shouldn't actually facilitate people getting back to work or staying in school, that we should actually help them to step away from that, because it would be too stressful for people. The stress would exacerbate their illness, that they'd experience failure. It wasn't even a they might, it was an inevitability, so the best thing to do was to protect them from that. And the idea was that all of these things were best avoided until people were well. But well was never defined. And of course, well is a little bit like the horizon, it's a moving target. So not surprisingly, the other thing that we were really effective at doing, I think, was helping people to get onto welfare and ultimately a disability support pension. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later, but what we never took into account in that view of the world is that we know in every other part of society that to be unoccupied, to be disengaged, is detrimental to your health, to every part of your health. And somehow or other we don't imagine that this same truth holds true for people with mental illness or people with psychosis. It's a bizarre disconnect in the way that we think about things. This is Mario's study that Joe mentioned before, but briefly what he found in that, this is a 7-year follow-up of people who'd been through EPIC. What he found was that if you hadn't made a functional recovery by the time you were 14 months into the service, even if you'd made a symptomatic recovery, you were much less likely at 7 years to have made a functional recovery. If you'd made a functional recovery by 14 months, but not necessarily a symptomatic recovery, at 7 years, you were much more likely to have made a functional recovery. Now, it's interesting because we're doing a study at the moment looking at dose reduction in first episode psychosis, which was inspired by the Wandering study. And what the Wandering study did, they did this sort of discontinuation thing, and what they found at the end of 2 years is it's a really bad idea to discontinue your medication. People had relapsed more, they were more unwell if they'd been in the discontinuation group. 5 years later, so at 7 years post-baseline, they followed these people up again, and the people who'd been in the discontinuation group were doing much better. They hadn't discontinued their medication. In general, they'd reduced it, but they were doing much better than the people who'd been on their medication the whole way through. So there's an interesting interaction between time and functioning that we need to explore a little bit better. The other reason that we need to get onto functioning early, and this gets to the point that I was saying about the way that I was trained, is if you look at the rates of people with mental illness as their primary disability on the disability support pension, it went from about a fifth of people in 2000 or 2001 to about a third of people in 2013 when they stopped reporting these data. The OECD has found that in Australia, people under 35 on the disability support pension, 50% of them have mental illness as their primary disability. Now, there's nothing wrong with being on a pension when you need it, but the problem with the disability support pension is it entrenches the beliefs we have about outcome. The two biggest exits from the disability support pension are the old age pension, which is a long way off for anyone who's 18, and death. And between those two outcomes, that accounts for 84% of people who get onto a disability support pension. And I think if 50% of the people under 35 on that pension have got mental illness as their primary disability, we need to be working a lot more with people to help them to achieve the things that they want to achieve. Just to make us not feel too bad about ourselves, Australia is no Robinson Crusoe on this. When you look across the OECD, the rate of people with mental illness as their primary disability on a disability payment, whatever it's called in different countries, we're in the middle of the road there a bit. But the most important reason I think that we need to get onto this early is this is because it's what young people actually want. If you actually ask young people what they want out of their time with services, they want their education and employment addressed, they want housing and relationships addressed, and they also want their health addressed, both their physical and mental health. But the things that they want most are their employment and education. And I'm not going to talk much about education in this presentation because I'm going to talk about that later today, and there was only so much that I could do in terms of doubling up without boring people, I suppose. So there was a range of employment interventions developed. Social firms are companies which trade with the public and they seek to make a profit, but they employ people who are otherwise marginalised from the regular labour force. So there's no issues around disclosure or anything else like that. In Australia, there are very few social firms, so that there's not that many options in terms of where people would like to work. Ideally, social firms will have enough structure in them that people could advance through the organisation, but my observation has been a lot of the social firms in Australia are pretty much a manager and a team, so there is actually no sort of way of gaining more responsibility as you have more experience. Transitional employment was an employment intervention that developed out of the clubhouse model in the US. And basically the idea with transitional employment is that you will work in a work experience-like setting, but for award wages for a period of time, usually between 6 or 9 months. And then the idea would be that you'd have gained skills sufficient to be able to transition into the regular labour market. The studies seem to show that only about 20% of people make that transition. So that's a bit of an issue for that. And then supported employment, which is this idea that basically you get people into jobs as quickly as you can and then you support them to stay there. And the most developed form of supported employment is this thing called individual placement and support, or IPS, and it's got these 8 criteria. So basically it's open to any person who says that they want to look for work. In this case, we'd also count education as one of those outcomes. It's integrated with the mental health treatment team, so we don't send people off to another agency where they have to explain themselves all over again, and where there's a lack of integration between their mental health treatment and their vocational recovery focus. It's focused on competitive employment, because if you teach somebody how to get a job in the open labour market, that's a skill that they can take with them through their lives. But also I think that if somebody gets a job through an interview process or some other competitive process, it actually is a powerfully normalising thing. It says to them, irrespective of what's going on with your life, I want to pay you for the skills that you bring to this company. You give people benefits planning, because most people aren't going into jobs that are so lucrative that they are going to not have to worry about making the transition from being on a benefit to not being on one. Get on with the job search quickly. So a lot of our young people who were going off to employment agencies, there was a sort of a 2-month kind of assessment period when they went to that agency. And if they were motivated on day 1, they most certainly usually weren't by day 30 or by day 60 before the job searching actually began. So we get on with the job searching as quickly as we can. Develop employer networks, because if you want to find people jobs, it's good to know people who've got jobs to give. Get people jobs that they actually want to do, not just looking for what's available and slotting people into whatever kind of opening there is. You know, there's the sort of, I mean, it's actually a real case, but it sounds like you'd make it up, that the young man who, had pervasive auditory hallucinations, who kept getting sent to do call centre work, mismatches of that kind, which are just really obvious, that you get people jobs that they can do and that they're wanting to do, and you give them support for as long as you need it, unless you're doing a research trial and you've got limited funding. IPS has been massively researched. It's one of the most researched interventions I think that there is. Basically, the take-home from this graph, which is a graph of Gary Bonds, who's a man in the US who collects the results of trials of IPS. Basically, the take-home from this is that whatever it's been compared to, wherever it's been compared, IPS has come out significantly better than the local usual best practice. Does it work in youth mental health? Because it was developed very much for people with chronic illness. We know that unemployment's a big issue in early psychosis. It was interesting, the data you put up, Joe, about the year 2000 employment rate in the service before you set up the EI service there, and it made me think, that's sort of 8 to 10%. And I thought, I wonder if that, because it's a number that's not uncommon when you look across things, and you go, I just wonder if we never did anything about it, because we just assumed that was just how the world was. And we just thought, oh well, that's just what happens, so let's not do anything about it. But it was interesting, by 10 years later, you had 60% of people. So the world can be different. So it's a big issue in early psychosis. To put that in the context of other stuff, because one of the things that people often say is, well, young people are more unemployed anyway. So the top 2 lines there, current youth unemployment, which is around about 11% in Australia. Youth unemployment, so that's the average. The second line, the second bar, is the average over the last 40 years, so between 1979 and now. You can see it's slightly higher than now. Headspace, if you look at their national average of people there, a bit higher. People with depression, borderline personality disorder and psychosis, from a study that was recently done at Orygen. And then from the SHIP study, people with schizophrenia. And you can see how that increases there. So this is not a problem of being young. People aren't unemployed at this level because they're young. They're unemployed at this level because they have mental ill health. And I was thinking, as I was putting these things together, this is actually an apt time, because we all like 5-year kind of round numbers. So there's actually been 15 years now of IPS in FEP research. Probably need some grammar work on that title. This is Miles Rinaldi standing on top of a mountain in Norway, because that's where you can find him if he's not at work in London. But in 2004, Miles published this paper, and what they'd done is they decided to just implement IPS in the service where Miles worked in South London. And what they found was that across the sort of 12 months of the trial, quite a high number of people moved into work, quite a high number of people moved out of unemployment and there was some good studying outcomes. So that was kind of the beachhead of IPS in first episode psychosis, I think. And that spurred a lot of other people, including us, to look at what we could do about this. So this has been slightly less here, 13 years. We started with this review that we published in 2006, somewhat presciently titled Exciting Career Opportunity Beckons. It was true in at least one person's case. And then we've done 2 RCTs since then. So in the first RCT, it was pretty small. It only had 41 people. And basically they got IPS for 6 months, and then we just looked at how people were going. And there was a really, really clear difference. So you can see that 13 people got work, 4 others got into courses, compared to 6 people in total in the control group getting those outcomes. People worked for longer, they earned more money, and they received less benefits because they didn't need them anymore. There would have been a bigger change in the benefits too if everybody was as straight with Centrelink as we had advised them to be. But you can understand, if people have been in precarious situations, why they're not completely willing to let go of a safety net just yet. And particularly back then, it was a difficult safety net to climb back into if you fell out of it. So then we did study 2, because once we'd proved something could work a little bit, it was easier to get money to find out whether it could work or not. More people, had 146 people, a longer follow-up. And basically what we found in study 2 was, again, that end of intervention, 6 months significant outcome. It was lost a little bit at 12 months, but you can see by 18 months it looks like it's beginning to return a little bit, and we're not quite sure why that was the case. The other thing to sort of say about this study is that the control group did really, really well. In fact, the control group in this study did better than the intervention group in a lot of the other IPS studies. And I think one of the reasons for that is that the culture at EPIC had changed around thinking about vocation as an outcome. It's one of the speculative reasons anyway. There's been a bunch of other work looking at this now. So the RAISE Connections program, so the US has recently conducted a number of large studies. So RAISE stands for Recovery After Initial Schizophrenia Episode. At one point in our whole journey, we're going to move away from acronyms, and it will be really good. But what they basically found was the time to employment was pretty quick. You can see there's a fairly steep rise and it tails off. And then the range of employment measuring at 6-month intervals, or the level of employment measuring at 6-month intervals, is really quite good. So there was 2 RAISE programs, so that was one, and the other one was RAISE Navigate. The red line are the people who are basically getting the supported employment and education in that, and it looks like that they're doing worse, but they started from a much worse place. And what the analysis of that study shows is that being in the group that got supported employment and education was the thing that made the difference in terms of their outcome. The final study that's been reported recently is a study of IPS augmented by this other intervention called the Workplace Fundamentals module, which is a thing which sort of teaches you the skills you need in the workplace at UCLA. And they've looked at 3 different outcomes. So starting on, let's see, so the middle outcome is combined education and employment. The one on the far side is education alone, and the one on this side is employment alone. And you can see that for all 3 of those outcomes, either combined or separated, it was significantly better to be in the IPS group. There's a few other studies that are ongoing, and I'm sort of mindful with Labor's announcement the other night of beginning to invest in that missing middle, of thinking about how we extend the evidence base for this to other groups. So there's a study just getting started at Orygen looking at IPS for young people with borderline personality disorder. So I mean, when I say it's getting started, it's literally we're still hiring the IPS worker. But the other thing that's actually happening at one of our Headspace centres is looking at how we augment IPS with vocational peer support workers. And that's a development which we're looking forward to sort of seeing how that's panned out shortly as well. So, some translation implementation in the last 5 minutes before coffee. The translation and implementation stuff is kind of important really, because we could actually just be sitting, churning out these papers, coming and talking at things like this, and not really changing very much, and definitely not having any impact on social media. But the importance of translation implementation, I think, is underlined by this quote, which is from the American Journal of Psychiatry from 1918. So it's now over 100 years old. And it's talking about the operations of the first outpatient psychiatric clinic in the States, which was in Boston, and it's just a report of their first 5 years of functioning. But it's describing it, and it was talking, this thing just leaped out at me. It said, some patients are referred for more investigation to a diagnosis, others for employment, a special worker being maintained who has charge of the latter. And I think to myself, well, they were doing IPS 100 years ago, because that's essentially what IPS is. We have a special worker who knows how to do this. And I think what got lost, what didn't stick, where was the implementation and translation that means 100 years later, we're reinventing the wheel, and there's generations of people who've had mental illness who've missed out on the opportunities that they could have had because this didn't happen. So what did we do? Well, we did a whole range of things, and I'm going to go through them pretty quickly. And not all of this is about psychosis, but if you want to see this plaque, it's across from Parliament up in Spring Street. Probably good for the politicians to walk past it a couple of times a day. As Pat said, we wrote this report in 2011, and this was about exploiting opportunities. So obviously we wanted to create this early psychosis system, but I wasn't beneath pushing my own barrow a little bit and making sure that the evidence-based IPS stuff was in there as well. And of course it then showed up in this document, which you'll be familiar with, as part of the functional recovery program. And then when we wrote the fidelity scale, you know that there's an item in there too that makes sure that IPS is the thing that's being done. We did translation for practitioners, so again you'll be familiar with these manuals among many, many others. I don't know why, this is why this is blank. This is because we did a whole lot of other just talking at politicians. So that was the good stuff we did. This is the sort of stuff that was important but didn't really change much. We participated in all of these different parliamentary inquiries. We gave them the facts. We participated in inquiries that weren't directly relevant but just lent to it. Gave them private briefings. But nothing really changed until we wrote this document, which is called Tell Them They're Dreaming. And basically it reviewed the policy landscape insofar as education and employment goes for young Australians with mental illness. And we followed that up in all sorts of media. And we talked to a lot of men, they were all men, some of whom might need employment support in a couple of weeks, who knows. But the thing that they had is that they were all, at the various times we spoke to them, the social services minister rather than the health minister, because social services picks up the tab for welfare. And what that led to, obviously IPS is a funded element of the HEP program, but there's now 24 Headspace sites, 14 operating and 10 more to start in the middle of the year, funded to provide IPS workers, so 2 IPS workers each, which exposes IPS to a population of around about 30,000 young people each year. Not all of them will need it, but that's the population of people who could actually benefit from it. And we know that from the 14 sites that were set up already, that there's better than 50% outcomes, which in terms of going from RCTs to real-world practice is a pretty good translation rate. And I'm going to tell you the simple advocacy argument that we use for stage 2, basically. It's a little more complicated than this, but this is what it boils down to. So we went to the Social Services Minister and said, you want to reduce your liability around the disability support pension, And we know that the average duration of time that somebody is on a DSP is 20 years. I suspect for young people with mental illness who get onto it, it's a lot longer than that. But 20 years is the average duration. 20 years of DSP funding is $470,000. The first lot of IPS funding for those 14 sites was $17 million. And in order to recoup that, we only need to divert 36 people from getting onto a disability support pension. When you think about the multipliers in this is enormously economically efficient and responsible. As of late 2018, so when these sites were only a little while established, we know that over 400 young people had successful vocational outcomes. Now, only 10% of those people need to have been diverted from getting onto a DSP to have made that $17 million pay for itself. In January, they committed another $17 million to extend and expand the trial. So now we only need to divert 72 people to have made this pay for itself. And I'm pretty sure that we will have done that. So I'm a simple person, I like simple arguments, so it's good for me. There's a few challenges, I think, in terms of implementation. It's great that we're getting this money in to fund these positions, but we actually need to develop a workforce. An IPS workforce is not ready-made, and talking about that INVEST trial that we had before, it's taking us a long time to hire someone for that position because this is a workforce that we need to make and think about how we train up. Fidelity got mentioned, I think, in Joe's talk around the way that services can drift away from models. IPS is a highly fidelity-based process, and there's a group from Western Australia who, for the Headspace trials, have been measuring fidelity, and it's really, really important that that is a continued funded part of that process because it will ensure that the service that people get is actually the service as it should be. Funding, it's great now, but it's, as you would all know from the journey that HYEP went through, funding can come and go, and we've got to keep advocating for it to be a more permanent part of the fixture. And of course, then there's the regional variation in economy as well, so that in some places there is less economic opportunity and less jobs than there are in other places, and we need to understand how we balance that out. And one of the things that I've been thinking isn't a big part of IPS, but maybe we could start to think about how we might put it in there, is more exposure to training people about how they want to start their own businesses as well, because there are a number of young people who have got great ideas. In fact, if we go back to our very first IPS study, there was a guy in the control condition who did better than anybody else in that study because he started his own business. He had skills as a concreter. He messed up our statistics a bit because he earned, in the 6 months that we were following him, like $50,000 and worked for the entire time. But we need to think about how we change things that way. Education and employment, I think we are at the point of looking at a little bit more research but a lot more implementation. When it comes to relationships, housing and health, I think we're still at the point where we need to do more to understand how we better incorporate these elements of recovery into the offerings that we have for young people coming to our services. So to conclude, I think, as been mentioned a fair bit, that the whole idea of early intervention in psychosis was predicated on this much broader approach to illness than had previously existed. It was explicitly about getting in early to reduce the disability that was associated with the illness, to reduce the poor functioning that was associated with the illness. And so I think functional recovery is a key enabler of early intervention altogether. I think over the last 15 years, great progress has been made around the evidence base for IPS in first episode psychosis, but we've got to do a lot more about making it routinely available for people. As you would all know, the psychosocial literature is full of really good evidence-based interventions that people don't have access to. And we've got some systems to get it to people now, but there's a paper coming out in a few weeks in Psychiatric Rehabilitation Journal which is looking at the development of IPS in Australia, and it makes the point that the only part of the mental health system in Australia which has done well in implementing IPS has been youth mental health. This is still not routinely available for people in other parts of the mental health system. We need to work on that. And I think, as I said, there's a lot more to be done in other areas of functional recovery research. So thanks.